Well, welcome everyone to our Mindful Reboarding Strategies Part 2 with Dr. Tracey Meyers here with Studio B. And for folks that are unaware of Studio B, just to let you know a little bit more about us, we are a progressive mindfulness training solution for corporations, nonprofits, individuals, and we are working to support the well-being of all of these organizations and individuals that we serve. And Studio B's platform is there for resources, especially during times of difficult stress, and we're here to support you. So please visit our community if you haven't done so. And I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Tracey Meyers with us today. Dr. Tracey Meyers is a licensed clinical psychologist. And in addition to being a senior facilitator with Studio B, Tracey works at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, a legal assistance program serving lawyers, judges, and law students. Prior to joining LCL, Tracey has worked for the Department of Mental Health in Connecticut, and in addition to the Department of Addiction Services, where she spent over 16 years working with inpatients and outpatients. Tracey has a strong commitment to integrative medicine for mental health and wellness, and leads mindfulness and yoga programs for groups, individuals, and professionals in the workplace. Just to mention a little bit more, in addition to her background in psychology, she's an advanced yoga teacher, certified yoga therapist, and meditation teacher. And in her forthcoming book, Transformational Healing Through Yin Yoga Therapy, you'll learn there's an extensive guide to utilizing yoga and meditation to support mental health and well-being. So we are so pleased to have Dr. Tracey Meyers here with us today. And without further ado, Tracey.
Thanks, Jess. And so nice to be back to talk a little bit more about reboarding, or what we might say is kind of up in the air, a hybrid approach to returning to work. And so today I'll be speaking about primarily the employer's perspective, but this is for all of us, whether we're an employee, an employer, or we have our own practice. The challenges that we're facing are similar. And so I'm going to be incorporating today some suggestions for employers how to work with the workforce as people are returning or maybe continuing to have a hybrid approach to their work. And of course, save time for questions and discussion as well if there are specific ideas that we want to spend some time on at the end. So I'm going to begin by starting with a PowerPoint, and we'll start here. So we'll be going through these objectives today, looking at the changes in the workplace, looking at results rather than hours. And this is sort of the heart of how do we redefine or look at our new workplace, focusing on well-being interventions to ease intensity, looking at this uncertainty, which we continue to navigate as a world, conflict resolution, because in that uncertainty, there often can be conflict that emerges in the workplace. And then finally, how do managers, employers, or if you're self-employed, how do we lead by example? What can we do to help companies see that we're all in this together, which is actually one of the pieces to helping our employees feel connected. All right, so I like to always start with what's happening in terms of the workforce. So we talked about this in the first presentation around the global summary of 2021, what happened during the pandemic. And we see that the pandemic affected these four spheres, and just helpful to go through them. First, some of them we're familiar with and some of them we may not be as familiar with. Looking at impact of people that are impacted by these different, that's the percentages. So life impact, 45% of the respondents were impacted. Lost pay, 50%. Working fewer hours, close to 50%, or stopped working. Lost a business. So you can see there were significant impacts during the pandemic, and we're still in the tail end, hopefully, of the pandemic. So some of these still actually are applying as we speak. Negative emotions, which we're going to spend some time looking at, are daily stress, worry, anger, and sadness. So our workplace is coming with a lot of stress, even when productivity hasn't gone down, or even when people haven't lost pay, these negative emotions have persisted. The other piece that we're going to be covering is the bottom left box, which is employee engagement. How engaged is the workforce? And then how much are people feeling like they're thriving, both in work and at home? And these numbers you can see are really startlingly low. 20% of the employees feel they're engaged actively in the workplace, and 30% thriving. So when we look at these two boxes today, and we're going to really look at those light blue boxes, the negative emotions and employee engagement as a doorway into not only trying to help people navigate during the pandemic, but perhaps changing the workforce for the better. So let's take a look now on results, not hours. So this has been such an interesting conversation and researchers are looking at it too, in terms of how do we actually look at how productive we are? And hours used to be the main way that we could do that. And we would always give a lot of credit to people that seem to go into the office early and leave late. I work with a lot of lawyers. That's part of my day job. And the lawyers will talk about how important it was to be in before the partners and to stay late. That was actually a badge of respect. And it was hard to leave early. Anyone who had to leave early or do a hybrid schedule or not in person for this meeting or that meeting, they may not have been on partner track as a result. So that culture persisted up into the pandemic. And we're just beginning to maybe course correct and say, well, if it's not about the hours in the workplace, because we may not even know if we're working virtually, what is important for a company and an organization and for employees? So let's look at what this actually means in terms of hours. So if we look at the results rather than the hours, the research suggests that the productivity depends. Some companies were able to maintain high levels of productivity during the pandemic being virtual, especially companies that were using the latest technology. So the technology and ease of being able to do one's work played a big role in productivity. And some companies were less productive, and they either weren't able to harness the technology to use, or their workforce wasn't up to speed. But the key factor was how the talent and the energy of the workforce was used. And in speaking to many, many people over the past year, some of the complaints I heard from employees were too many meetings, too many Zoom meetings, emails floating in and out all day, having trouble balancing time, not knowing the expectations, not sure what to do, never meeting with the supervisors, losing track of billable hours. So there was a lot of confusion, which suggests that the talent and the energy of the workforce weren't being used that well for those folks. So what are the keys when we think about how to manage our workforce? That's a huge topic. But what they found during the pandemic, researchers found, and this is a Harvard Business Review study, they found that minimizing wasted time. So really being selective about meetings and about how the workforce is being utilized. Capitalizing on new technology, again, the ability to quickly get information, the ability to schedule meetings, shared calendars, etc. And focusing on employees that are the exceptional talent. So I want to say something about this because I was meeting with a company a few weeks ago, and they talked about how frustrating it was to keep trying to work with the staff that were not invested and how much time they would give to those people, and they continue to be unhappy. And in fact, the research suggests that we don't actually benefit much from focusing on the staff that are not interested in working, the disgruntled staff. In fact, the exceptional talent staff, the ones we take for granted and often don't pay that much attention to, that's the group that makes the biggest difference in our productivity. And in fact, talented employees contribute to a 20% increase in productivity. Yet we tend to let them do their thing, right? And I found this out myself as a manager and a supervisor that, you tend to just not look at the people that are just seamlessly doing the work. But the data suggests that that's the key, to actually focus on them, and that we can turn not away from the folks that are not invested. There's other strategies we're going to talk about in a moment for those folks, but to make sure that we're really keying in on getting talented employees to feel invested and engaged in the workforce, and to maintain that, to continue to help them, utilize their talents. So that subgroup is really important to consider, and think about it for yourselves. How do you utilize your most talented workforce? And do you tend to take them for granted? Are you incentivizing them? Are you giving them new opportunities? So how do we look at this group? And I love this idea of both engagement and inspiration. So an engaged employee, again, Harvard Business Review says 45% more productive than an employee who's simply satisfied with their work. So engagement is really important. And then you add in a nice heaping dose of inspiration. And this takes productivity to even higher level, 55% more productive. So engagement and inspiration. How do we get our employees to feel actively engaged in the company and the work they're doing, and then be inspired? So adding in something that matters more than just the daily work, something that has meaning, right? And you can see the opposite happens when people have a decline in productivity, when companies struggle. Often there's been poor collaboration, less efficient time management, and you get that decrease in employee engagement. And we saw during those first slides that I showed that the workforce across the world has a low engagement level. So we can do a lot to just think through, how do we engage and inspire our workforce? How do we engage and inspire? And think through, perhaps for yourself, what has been inspiring for you? It might be, and again, I work a lot with lawyers, so I pull on some of those pieces. And often lawyers will tell me what inspires them is when they see that they have made a difference in someone's life. And so we talk about finding a balance of doing pro bono work, for example, volunteering, taking on something for the organization that helps to give back. So that inspiration piece, often it does involve a greater good, something that gives us meaning and personal strength, and feeling like we're contributing to society. And engagement also requires feeling like you belong, that you're seen for your values. So it's really also about tapping into what are the talents that our employees bring, our unique talents often. So those pieces, which we can overlook when we're looking just at the numbers, right, are key to keeping employees engaged, satisfied, and then ultimately increasing overall productivity. So the other piece that I wanted to bring up is this correlation between productivity and higher mental health. So again, thinking back to that early slide about those two boxes that we're focusing on today, mental health and engagement. So higher mental health. So what does higher mental health mean? So higher mental health means being free from significant emotional distress that interferes with daily functioning. That doesn't mean that there's no stress. We're all operating under high levels of stress. But how much is it affecting daily life, right? And if it starts to affect daily life, we're going to be less productive at work and at home. Interestingly, and again, looking at the World Health Organization, I love to look at the whole world versus just North America or the United States. When we look at the data, 9 out of 10 people feel as if they're getting as much, if not more, work done at home. So productivity, again, does not correlate with office hours. So there is something about home and productivity that people are finding to be helpful. And I love this quote that it's a British study from the University of Southampton. Latent demand for permanent, flexible working pattern changes have been unlocked. In other words, during this pandemic, something got unlocked where we actually realized all along, I think people have been asking for this, particularly working parents or people caring for their elderly parents, this idea that we can work from home or have this flexible schedule. Employers must be ready to meet that demand with well-defined positions on hybrid and flexible working for every job role, both for the existing workforce and new recruits. So this is one of these things that we can look at as the workplace is going to change for good. It's already changing for good because we see that people are productive, that there are so many benefits. And we'll talk in a moment about how working from home can actually increase mental health ability, the ability to navigate stress. So let's take a look at this piece here. So mental and emotional health and well-being matter, not just in terms of productivity, but job satisfaction and job retention. I work with a bunch of law students who are starting to interview. They're like in their 3L, third year of law school, and they're beginning to look at where they want to work. And so they're interviewing at very large law firms, some of them. And this new generation of lawyers who are young, many of them, are now asking about, well, what are work-life balance opportunities? What does your company offer? How do you balance well-being? How do you see these hybrid schedules? So the new workforce is actually asking for and expecting that companies are going to have a well-defined work-life balance. And in fact, that's a selling point when getting new employees on board. This is what we offer. So many of you, hopefully are starting to take advantage of that, because employees are more satisfied when they see that the company cares about this. So what are the key determinants when we think about better mental health? Number one, fewer physical health symptoms. So for our workforce to feel healthy, they have to be healthy physically. Working to the contracted hours, so keeping the hours at a reasonable level. We know that actually productivity doesn't suffer when we work less. I just saw the New York Times this morning had an article about the 4-day work week. And, this idea that can we be more productive by working 4 days a week? So these things are not only just in theory, but they're becoming a reality if we're not just focused on the hours. If we're not just focused on the hours, we can see how all of these other well-being initiatives can actually increase productivity. More frequent contact with managers. So this was one of the artifacts of the pandemic, where that there was this disconnection. People didn't have regular meetings with their supervisors or managers as often. Many people, again, many clients I worked with would say, I don't even know, I haven't seen my supervisor in months. I have no idea how I'm doing. My job performance, they didn't even do a job performance this year. When we get less feedback, we actually are less engaged. And in fact, when we get less feedback, when we do get feedback, it can feel jarring and very negative, right? And so it's really key to have regular meetings and be getting feedback. That's one of the ways to increase employee engagement. Higher levels of satisfaction with work-life balance. So this is at the heart of so much of what Studio B is offering with their platforms designed for companies, is that we know there has to be some work-life balance, both within the day, just the regular work day, but also after work. How are we taking care of our employees? And how are we setting parameters to give them options to be able to take care of themselves? Again, it's not just being benevolent, it actually impacts productivity, job retention, and job satisfaction. All right. So a couple of other things I want to say about well-being here, and this is a whole big topic, of course. Employees that struggled the most during the pandemic were often people that already had mental health conditions, struggled with isolation, and had work-life balance difficulties, such as caring for young children during the work hours. And I love this quote, and it's so true if we think about it. It's the people who aren't making a lot of noise who are struggling the most. So think again for your organization where you're working, or your own life, and the times where you ended up struggling and maybe not asking for help, maybe keeping that quiet, hoping that nobody would notice that you're having a difficult time. And if we're virtual, how difficult it is to actually see how people are doing. So that idea, when we don't know how someone is doing, instead of assuming they're fine, I like to ask, hey, how are you doing? This proactive checking in. So not assuming that if we don't hear from someone that all is well. So here are the red flags. And, I am telling you this both as a therapist that works with a lot of people who are struggling, but also as someone who has worked with, people and employees that are having a difficult time in different settings, hospital settings and in law settings. So lack of engagement, non-engagement, that's the first red flag. When people are disengaged, and this can be in subtle ways or not so subtle, that we know can be a red flag in terms of job retention. So disengagement might look, certainly in the virtual world, we know people aren't showing up for meetings. If they are showing, they're off camera, not responding to things in a timely way, not offering to take on projects, right? So this really kind of backing off. and often hoping that others aren't going to catch on. So sometimes there's shame or embarrassment. And that's what I see too. When there's a lack of engagement, underneath is also some fear or shame, where people don't want to be seen. Then there's the ghosting, which of course is, much more prevalent now, where people don't return for months sometimes, and or may not even tell the employer that they're leaving. There's been a lot of interesting research showing how people often will not even give notice anymore. The idea of being hired in a pandemic, never meeting the person live, can give us sort of this almost dissociative quality where we don't even feel real to each other. And because we don't feel real to each other, that human, let's sit down and talk about this, or even giving notice and going through a proper exit interview, doesn't happen as much anymore. So as managers, and employers, we want to take a look at when we're starting to see these trends. There's a critical window where there is time to get folks, I think, back on board, to look at those ideas of inspiration and engagement. But after that critical window, we start to see people checked out more and more. That's often when it's difficult to get those folks back in. And at that point, we may have lost critical engagement time. And we have to decide, at that point, are we able to salvage? Can we get folks back on board? And also, how much energy as managers do we expend trying to get those folks back in? Or do we move toward the talented, exceptional employees and getting them to continue their high levels of productivity? So there's not a right or wrong answer, but in general, we can spend a lot of time trying to get folks back in once they're lost to us. So looking at these early red flags can be very helpful in terms of getting someone engaged who was previously disengaged. And even asking those questions: what would engage you? What do you want to work on? What matters most to you? It's really interesting to find that out. So well-being interventions, and I like this idea of it being both a community-based and individual-based way of operating. And when I work with clients, I often think about, what are you doing together and what is your own individual toolkit? So I love team mindfulness breaks, and really starting and ending with some kind of mindfulness practice. And it could be very, very short, 1 to 3 minutes. I work with one law firm, and they are very busy across the world, multinational. They have firms all throughout US, Asia, UK. And one of the things we do, we've actually found a time, which can be difficult, but a call-in time where people, they don't even have to go on screen, but they literally call a number and do breathing together. And you can see all the phone numbers from across the world. And it's really lovely. It's a very low demand, but it's this idea of, like, we're in it together and we're taking this time to practice. And that sense of being connected and also actually, breathing, feeling ourselves, really be present. Well-being trainings, that this can be an integral part of the workday, just like we would do different trainings on any topic, depending on what your company is offering. If this becomes a regular staple, having a well-being committee, that is really important. We're encouraging all the firms we're working with to have a well-being committee and actually give trainings to employees about, different topics that they find important. So it's not just lip service, it's actually bringing that on a regular basis. I love the virtual platforms that are customized, like Studio B offers, which really focus on what the company needs. What's the daily productivity like for the company? What are the stressors that this company uniquely faces? Is it in healthcare? Is it working in a volatile industry where the stress is unremitting? So really looking at that. I'm working with a company that does a lot of work with people that have had trauma, vicarious traumatization. They're working with an underserved population. So we've been doing vicarious trauma and secondary trauma trainings. So that's this way of customizing it for the company. So that also can help prevent burnout. So we have to know what people are struggling with in order to know what to bring to them as well. So what can we do from a management perspective in terms of engagement? So we talked about, like, the whole organization doing trainings, but the weekly supervision is so important. And when we value our employees and we take the time to sit down with them, each week faithfully, even if there's not much to say, even if they say, I don't have much. It's so important to just do that check-in, to get the eyes on and to feel like you matter. Engagement can only happen if you feel like you're valued in some way. And then from that supervision, it may be clear that the person is struggling, right? And then the referral may be to get some coaching. So maybe the person would benefit from having coaching around time management and productivity, or something that they feel is a growing edge or a weakness. Employee assistance programs. So, it's during that weekly supervision that often we can glean out if mental health issues are challenging. And employees may struggle to want to acknowledge that, but when you get to have a weekly time, they may acknowledge, they may not say, I'm feeling depressed or anxious, but you may hear words like stress or overwhelmed or I'm struggling, right? So the EAP programs, this idea of getting some short-term counseling. And often, a lot of good research showing somewhere between 1 and 3 individual sessions can make a huge difference if it is a stress-related condition. It doesn't take it away, but it can be that talking about and narrowing down the focus to a couple of key issues. So I love EAP, the idea of short-term work. And for some people, it may be a longer-term endeavor, but just getting the foot in the door to being able to talk to somebody. Support groups, and these can be anything from stress management, support groups. Sometimes companies will have recovery groups if people are struggling with substance use. Sometimes it can be, I run one group for busy lawyers called Super Moms, and it's about moms working, right? So we're doing a support group about how to do work-life balance. And the women feel so validated because in a more corporate setting with their male counterparts, they may not feel comfortable sharing some of the vulnerabilities of caring for a child. So finding affinity groups and groups of people that are struggling and also working on strategies together. I'm also working with a group of employees that have learning disabilities, neuroatypical or neurodiverse issues. And that can be very validating. If you have ADHD, how do you work on Zoom all day? So finding out what your employees are looking for and where they may be struggling. And you don't even have to have anyone run the group. It can be a self-run group. Peer groups can be really potent and also can help people feel like a sense of belonging when they often feel on their own. So I'm a big fan of support groups. If, again, if you survey your employees, you may find that it might be about work-life balance. It may be about substances like alcohol or internet or other things, but it also could be very basic around just focusing. So this other piece around the uncertainty, and of course, even when we were planning these reboarding, the Delta variant came and all of a sudden it was like, oh, wait, actually, it's not going to be about people just coming back in person yet. So we know that we're going to be continuing to have uncertainty. And the more that we address this rather than being caught off guard, the more that we give our employees a sense of confidence that we got this, even though there are a lot of uncertainties and things keep changing. Our social interactions, right? Like just helping people know how to do that and, setting the stage so an employer, can say, confidently, we're going to just go around and if we're in person, we're going to do it this way. So just giving a sense of the culture so that people don't feel embarrassed if they don't want to shake hands. So how do we do that? And how can we modify that as things change? Conflicts around employees. So there's going to be some conflicts that come up and we want to think about how do we manage that because people have such strong views around masking and vaccination practices and social distance. So we can expect that that's going to happen. And I'm going to talk in a few moments a little bit about conflict resolution. And finally, this anticipatory anxiety about living with the threat of the pandemic, right? And really not downplaying that. When the numbers go down, we sort of forget that there are many people that are still really anxious. Maybe they have underlying illnesses. Maybe they're caring for elderly parents. Maybe they have young children that have not been yet vaccinated. So just because we may feel confident and feel good that maybe we have had our vaccinations or we live in a zone where there are less outbreaks. So just this gentle reminder that people are struggling and that they need to feel like at least they can verbalize that. So this proactive checking in, listening, and really letting employees express how they're feeling and being flexible to that landscape. So don't be afraid to ask, even if it brings up diverse opinions, which it likely will. So I like to think about conflict resolution proactively, because we all tend to have a style, right, of how we handle conflict. And if you're a manager, you also have your own style. And then your employees are going to have their own style. And when we can recognize our style, that helps us develop maybe some skills if we want to shift our style, or to actually help us reinforce that that style is really effective. So these are very familiar to many, many of us. The idea, of course, is the bullseye, that assertive behavior, where we can hear feedback, where we don't have to be right, but we actually are confident in how we're sharing information, right? So that's that assertive, that's like the bullseye that we're reaching for. But many of us can kind of have a default strategy, which, may be one of these three, which is passive aggressive, aggressive, or passive. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I think this slide's kind of fun, thinking about, especially, and you can see in this left column, some of the nonverbals and then the beliefs and emotions that underlie our style. Because these are a little less, I think, obvious than you may think. So we have passive, right, which is keeping quiet, not sharing, apologizing when you express yourself. And maybe there's that sense of looking small, acting kind of like you don't want to be seen. But here's the beliefs that I want you to look at. Others' needs are more important than yours. People have rights, but ours aren't important. People's contributions are valuable, but not yours. And underlying that can be a fear of rejection, helplessness, frustration, even anger. Reduce self-respect. And the goal in this style is to avoid conflict. So you might see yourself here. And again, we may be all of these at different times. But looking at aggressive, again, we know what that looks like on the outside, and often we can see it on the nonverbal behaviors. But the beliefs, people that are aggressive sometimes, I wouldn't say all the time, but often feel that their own rights are more important than others, that other people's views are not as important, that there's a sense of anger and powerfulness, the sense of victory, right? And then sometimes afterward, guilt or remorse for trampling over people. And this can happen sometimes when we are over stressed. We might find that these styles come out more in us. Maybe it's what we were modeled as kids. Maybe we had a parent that had that style, or a boss that had that style. And then goals: win at any expense, gain control. And sometimes, depending on the corporate landscape, that may be what we're supposed to be doing. Lawyers, again, struggle with this because they're taught to win at every turn, right? So it can be very hard to actually develop a more open and willingness to listen stance. Passive aggressive. This one I see all the time. And again, I see it in myself, I see it in people, and I'm sure we all can relate to this. So it can look passive, but it's a lot of kind of denial. It's like not actually saying something, but your behaviors often say something. The idea of like, oh, sure, I believe what you're saying, but then you're actually not believing. There's a lack of responsibility for actions that can happen. There's fear here, just like there's fear in the passive style. Fear if you're rejected, fear that if you say what you really want, it'll be perceived as negative. Yet there's a resentment underlying it. And people don't want to be called out on that, right? So the goal is getting your own way without having to take responsibility, right? And so that can be really difficult. And finally, assertive, which is where we're going with our conflict resolution, which means that there's this genuine expression of feelings that are direct and honest, and seeing people's needs as equal. And that's really where I'm going with this idea, that the needs of self and the needs of other are equally important. This ability to hear and see that we all have something valuable to contribute. And this has been so hard during the pandemic with things like social distancing, vaccination, masks, right? This is where just the idea of seeing people's needs as equally important can really, really come up against fears, anxieties, and frustrations, right? The emotions with assertiveness are you feel positive about yourself and also how you treat others. Self-esteem goes up and you and others keep your self-respect. That's actually the goal. And I think that's true for employers. We really want to maintain self-respect, right? That goes back to keeping employees feeling engaged and inspired. It starts with that foundation of self-respect. So difficult conversations, and these are certainly happening more than ever now. And it might be around, the pandemic is specific, or it could be around mental health, productivity, any of the topics we're talking about today. So I like this little decision tree. I love decision trees because it always helps me think through what's actually going on underneath. And this is how we can unearth sometimes our passive aggressive or passive style when we look at our what we're really trying to communicate. So number one, do you want to have a conversation with someone who holds a different view of your own than yourself? Sometimes the answer is no, right? I don't want to hear it. And then we can get pretty stuck when the answer is no. But let's say the answer is yes. And then think through, do you actually really want to have this conversation, or is it more to argue? And sometimes the answer is yes, I want to argue. I want to point out why the other person is wrong, right? And again, we're going to get stuck at a dead end when we go down that path. Or if we generally actually want to hear, we want to listen, that's when we can begin to do some of the listening skills that really help with these difficult conversations. Just repeating back, using the I statements, asking open-ended questions. So I'll often say, if I'm working with an employee that has a strong view, I'll say, tell me more about that. And just let them speak. And when you have that interest, you'll often see that beyond their initial anger or bluster, there's something else there. And then a few more questions to ask. Do you really want to understand their perspective? If the answer is no, again, it's kind of a dead end. That's where the conversation stops. But if there is, can you be curious and non-judgmental? And sometimes we have to assume they have a positive intention. Again, this is so hard. We have not seen this modeled well in the past many years, right? How do we actually assume the other person wants to be heard? And they also have fears and concerns. So I like to often start with that idea. This person wants to be understood. This person wants to be heard. This person is struggling just like me, right? So if we give them the benefit of that, then often we can hear more clearly what they're really saying. And finally, I like to think about in difficult conversations, what's my goal? Is it to persuade the other person to change, which sometimes is the case where we really do need to do persuasion? And if that is so, can you still make sure that you're understanding their perspective and you're showing respect? Employee engagement relates to feeling respected and heard, right? And then the other piece of common ground, and both of these may be true. We may be wanting to persuade, but we also can find this common ground. And I love this where we can actually reach across and see, what do we share? One of the things I learned growing up is I'm a huge baseball fan. I've been gifted with a long lineage of being a New York Met fan, which many people might feel sorry for me, as I've only seen one World Series victory in my lifetime. But the idea of being able to talk baseball was a skill my dad passed down to me. And because of that skill, I can find common ground with people that have really different views. I learned this when I was doing my internship at a VA center, working with older vets. And at first I was, 28 years old. What did I have in common with people? What would they think of me coming in? And we could talk baseball. I'd say, hey, what's your favorite baseball team? And they saw that I really knew a lot about sports. And I love that gift of being able to talk about my struggling team because we find this commonality. And once we can find that common ground, we can really hear the other person and we can see their worries and their basic humanity. So it doesn't have to be about sports, of course. It might be about gardening or many other things. But, just that idea of being able to see the person and feel that shared bond, which can help us with feeling like a sense of belonging. All right, so just a couple of more pieces I want to say. So leading by example. So as managers or leaders in your company, or if you're self-led, this idea of first of all, fostering a leader autonomy way of operating. So that's encouraging the employees to manage their own workflows, really avoiding the micromanaging. And over again, research shows that when people feel that they're self-led, where they can manage their own flow of work, they can solve their problem. Their boss is still there to come in, but there's a lot of autonomy. That style leads to the highest levels of productivity. So leading by example means letting the employees manage what they're doing, including sometimes their time, which was really hard for many managers to do. Managers also setting boundaries, making sure you're clear when you're sending your emails, right? Being clear about the urgency of items. That is so key to your workplace, so that they're not getting these late night or weekend emails, which again can make everyone feel like, oh, I got to show up. I got to do this on a Saturday. Taking care by participating in wellness opportunities and doing this carefully. It can be tone deaf for a manager to come in and say, oh, I'm doing all these well-being activities, and the workforce or the employees have no time to do this. So we want to make sure that it actually is matching the time allocated to the workplace. So if there's a well-being seminar and everyone's involved and invited, that's great for the manager to show up at, right? Employers that are willing to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, right? So that creates a more open exchange where an employee might come back with a good idea and feel that they're valued. That's how we create inspiration too, when we don't have to know it all as the employer. The compassion and care goes such a long way. Over and over again during the pandemic, we saw so many examples of compassion and care helping people stay connected. And if someone is struggling, to be able to reach out, it really matters. And again, we have to do this carefully. If it looks like it's, not done with compassion, or if it looks like it's done in a way that could be held against the person, then people are not going to be open. But taking the time to just sit down and check in, to ask about how someone is doing, ask about someone's family, or how they're holding up during the pandemic, it can go a long way. And that compassion, can create a sense of belonging and engagement. And then what are the resources? And really having clear delineated resources when employees are struggling. It is helpful. I often tell this to different corporations. It's like have a decision tree where you can really look at, if someone's coming in with this issue, that you have 3 or 4 or 5 suggestions, so that it isn't just this simple like, oh, you should go to EAP. And or have the person walk away feeling embarrassed that they even said anything. Being able to refer people for proper treatment, and that doesn't mean you have to know names particularly of therapists, but how do you give them options and considerations? Where can you help people turn to? So I want to stop here and see if there are any questions, and say, we're going to be talking in the 3rd series about the employee and how employees can help navigate these challenging times. But yeah, so any questions or comments about some of the things we talked about today? I wanted to say one more if there's any questions. Oh, did you have a question, Paula?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about, so I'm back in the office now after being at home for 18 months. And, very blessed that it's a small team, and I'm not really super worried. But I've noticed that there's more opportunity to be busy in terms of like socializing with people, but that I'm also more energized by being in the office. So I just was wondering if you had any feedback on how to stay a little more focused. Like now there's suddenly people.
It's true. And I think it's so, right, that energy, because we've been so isolated. I love this idea of a soft landing, and like, it is going to take time to reacclimate. My daughter says the same thing when she goes to school now with all her friends, like there's a lot of talking and energy. So the soft landing approach, which is that there may be more time for reconnection as you go back to work. And that may take 3 months of really starting to work with people and collaborate at first and enjoying that. That is important for engagement. So our productivity per se may be lower on those moments, but those are also ways that we can long-term stay inspired. And I think, that self-monitoring, of course, over time, we're going to need to be able to set those boundaries, but it may seem like a lot, but we used to do that all before the pandemic. We just forgot that. Before the pandemic, we went out for coffee and we had lunch and we picked up our dry cleaning and we chit-chatted and those informal conversations happened, it just doesn't feel as familiar. So I would say that. I'd say a soft landing, relishing that because it's actually really important. And the third is probably it's actually very close to how we were before. Yeah. Yeah. The other piece I wanted to say just briefly before we end is this ongoing way to give feedback to your staff, to continue to really work on, we talked about weekly supervision, but to continue to work on helping both, I just read this study yesterday in my psychology journal about a feedback sandwich. And I want to end on this idea. When we're giving feedback, working with our employees, to be able to give them feedback sandwiched in between all of the things that we saw that were working well. So if we're giving instruction or giving correction, we want to sandwich it with, these are the things that you've been engaging beautifully with. These are the things that have inspired, continuing to use that language. So we want to make sure that we're ongoing, giving people things that they can both work on, but also to continue to nourish inside of themselves. So feedback sandwich, I'm playing with that. I love that idea of sandwiching that between compassion and engagement and inspiration. So again, I'm so happy to talk about these important strategies to returning to work, the hybrid approach, this ongoing uncertainty, and look forward to seeing you again for our third part, which will be looking at the employee role and how we can, as employees, navigate these challenges. So thank you so much to Studio B for hosting and for being open to these different topics. And thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you again. So have a good early fall, and we'll see you soon.